Colonel, the people on street, they calculate, the estimation would come out, and my opinion is more than 12 million people, much more than almost, it goes maybe double the population of Israel, the people on street right now. And this is the country, a little country in the West Asia that feels that they can attack each and everybody, they can kill people, they can destroy the other countries. And their argument, basically, you said about how Donald Trump was convinced, or the United States was convinced to start this war. That was basically, I would say, eh, that sort of information, if he got something from the Middle East, basically comes from Mossad and CIA. And Mossad is so active in the West Asia, and they gather information from Iran. So they were basically deceiving the whole system in favor of the war to achieve what Netanyahu wanted for such a long time, and which was the war against Iran. And this is, I don't know what is the, when it comes to the intelligence, with something like this happens, how is that gonna, what would be the repercussions of these things, that it's totally the opposite that what they were telling us before? And
Well,
is that gonna bring some sort of repercussions to these people?
we have to understand how intelligence works. And you talk about CIA, you talk about Mossad. If you look at those who have been more critical in Israel in particular, but also in the US towards the war, and about the whole thing about the nuclear bomb in Iran and things like that, those have been the more critical, is the Mossad. And the CIA, by the way, in the US. I've worked with both of them, and I know that you have, and you have in your, also in your guests, you have some former CIA analysts. I've worked with them at that time, when I was, and they are not. CIA analysts are not stupid. They are very good. In fact, they are brilliant. And that was my conclusion when I saw them. And that's why we have to understand how intelligence works. You have within the intelligence system, you have people who make analysis. These are brilliant people. They are recruited for that, by the way. And the same applies to Mossad. And those people understand the situation quite well, and even very well. And they provide sound, reliable, and intelligence assessment on the situation. Now, the problem is that, and that applies to large intelligence organizations especially, when you have, like the CIA, when you go, it's like a pyramid, if you want. And the bottom part of the pyramid is made by all these experts, analysts, and things, people you never hear about, but they are brilliant. The upper part of the pyramid is more political. These are nominated because of their allegiance to the system, because they are politically correct, because they are in tune with the president or with the current administration. Meaning that the bottom and the upper part of the pyramid may not have the same view on things. And that's extremely important to understand. Myself, when I was in during the Cold War, I come from it was a tiny intelligence service, tiny, really. But it's so tiny that it didn't need to be politicized. And my counterpart was probably one of the director, or yes, one of the, let's put it that way, director of CIA or things like this. Not the upper one, but let's say the under. I don't have the term right now, but very in the mid management, upper mid management, if you want. But they were politicized in the US, while with us, that was still, we were still in the technical domain. And that gives to a service that is very tiny like mine, the one I was in at that time, a considerable advantage, because we could make the assessment that we found proper to do, because that was really fact-based. We didn't take any political consideration into our assessments. While at a certain level in the CIA, you had to put some political element in the assessment, meaning that somehow you distort the assessment. And that's exactly the same you have in the Mossad. Exactly the same thing. And if you listen to former directors of the Mossad, these are the ones who are the most critical of the policy of Netanyahu, the policy against Palestinians, the policy towards Iran, and things like this. Now, those two institutions, this could apply to other institutions, the DGSE in France, the MI6 in the UK, and so on, you name it. In any case, the problem is that when you belong to the Mossad, regardless of, and especially if you are an operative agent, meaning not an analyst, but the one who conduct clandestine operations and things like this, you are not requested to do what you think. You're requested to do what you are ordered to do, period. So, of course, when the CIA or Mossad is tasked to conduct such operation, they have to do it because that's part of the system. You can say they could quit and things like this. Okay, but let's put that aside. The thing is that regardless of what individuals may think, and you may even have that in an army, for instance, that at some level people think differently, but since they are in the system, they have to do what the organization asks them to do. And that's why we very often have a distorted understanding of those institutions. I'm not here to whitewash the CIA for all these crimes and all that. It's not my purpose, but just to explain what it is. When we talk about the 9/11, for instance, or not the 9/11, sorry, the invasion of Iraq, the CIA opposed the assessment that was made by Donald Rumsfeld in order to have to blame Iraq for those weapons of mass distractions, and the CIA opposed, and in fact that prompted Donald Rumsfeld to establish a strategic assessment office within the Department of Defense to produce assessments that were in tune with what Rumsfeld thought, because he didn't want to rely on those assessments of the CIA who said, no, Iraq has no weapons of mass distractions. So from the outside, especially for those who are not specialists, you don't see these nuance in the way the intelligence organizations work. What we see today is that because of the personality of our leaders, the political leaders, I mean, you have that in the US with Trump, you have that in France with Macron, and so on. These people are so we have so big self-esteem that they dare to bypass what their own intelligence service say. And that's where the whole thing starts to be dangerous, because that means that the decision making is no longer based on a proper process, because decision making, and that's very true in the US, that's very true in most countries, by the way, that you have very codified, in theory at least, or that was so, let's say 30 years ago and more. You had a very codified decision-making process. And before reaching the decision, you had to go through different steps where the intelligence were bringing their own assessments. And the idea of this codified decision-making process that you have in the military, for instance, is precisely to be sure that you integrate all the different knowledge actors, those who know, into the decision. Now, because our leaders are so self-centered, that they take the freedom to bypass all these processes and to decide on their own, not relying on the process. And that's where you have the risk of having bad decision, and that's exactly what has become in Iran. And that's the danger of this situation. You see that in Europe. This is very true, for instance, and there are many reports, by the way, on this for the European Union, that Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, by the way, they make decisions just with a very tiny number of advisors, and they bypass the work that is done in their own administrations, because in the EU, as in everywhere, you have an administration that is there to prepare assessment for the sake of making decisions. Now, if you work isolated in your bubble somewhere in the last floor of your building, and you are just surrounded by a very tiny number of advisors, you don't care about what the rest says. You just decide. And that's where you make the mistakes, or that's where the mistakes can cost the most, because you make mistake without realizing that you are making a mistake, because there is no proper because the purpose of an intelligence organization and those structures that help making decision is not just to say Iranians are bad, so we have to strike. It's not exactly that. It's also about to identify the risks. If you take option one, you have the risk of this, this, and this. If you take option two, you have this benefit, but you have this, and this risk, and think like this. Meaning that when you take the decision, you choose an option and you know what are the risks. But if you don't have someone who is there to identify the risks related to each possible decision, then you just engage into a decision without knowing what will happen. And that's exactly what's happening in the US today. Now they realize that they were trapped. You see, that's something that should have been identified well before, because they have indicated, I mean, Trump has indicated that he wanted to do something with Iran. So he had several months to prepare the situation, to prepare his war, and to identify what would be the risks, what are the opportunities, where are the risks. But obviously, he didn't make this calculus. As a result, he engaged into a situation based solely on what Benjamin Netanyahu told him. And Benjamin Netanyahu works for his own. This is not a person who works for humanity. He doesn't work for the world. He doesn't pay any attention for the Middle East. He just do things because it's not even for Israel. It's for the sake of his own skin, because if he lose power, he would be indicted or having the trial for corruption and so on and so forth. I don't know. I don't remember exactly. So meaning that he needs to have war. And therefore, that's his purpose, period. So it's not even for Israel. It's for Benjamin Netanyahu, period. So this is the danger of such situation, this inability to have a proper decision making that make proper assessment of both the opportunities and the risk in engaging in a conflict or whatever policy. And yes, that I think the one of the lessons. Another lesson I think from these funerals, and that's where you just mentioned the numbers, and you said that you had in the streets of Isfahan and Tehran and others, you have twice or three times the population of Israel. This is not, well, this is also something, obviously, but what I would pay attention to as an Israeli is the fact that you even had a Saudi delegation there. Remember that Iran and Saudi Arabia are factually at war. And nevertheless, you had a Saudi delegation attending the funerals, showing that the hate between the two countries is probably not as profound as people may think. By the way, it shows something that I've already mentioned: the maturity of this Middle Eastern polity towards the one you see in Europe, for instance. In Europe, nobody wants to talk to the Russians. Are so bad. You don't talk to Putin. You don't. It's kind of a childish type of behavior. When they even forbid trees to be a part of contest for the nicest tree in Europe, because it's a Russian tree, so it cannot be part of the contest. That shows how far it goes in Europe. And now in the Middle East, you see something completely different. We are at war with the other country, but we respect the leader of that country at the same time. And therefore, we come to present respect to this person. And that goes beyond the simple, the guts here. We are not here. It's not even the brain that speaks, it's the heart. And that is something that should worry Israel, because that shows that, in fact, Iran is not the real enemy. It is an enemy because the Americans have decided so, and because somehow they created a situation in which all these Gulf Cooperation Council were, in fact, taken or pushed into this conflict, but they didn't really wanted it. Of course, all these countries could have said to the US, stop using my territory and things like this. Now, obviously, the US, especially Donald Trump, is so unpredictable that probably those countries don't dare to do so. But at the same time, it shows that despite this situation, there are things that are above the missiles. There are things that are above the drones and all that. And that is the kind of thing. That's something I have mentioned several times. We discussed this issue a few times a couple of years ago when we talked about the Palestinian uprising on the 7th of October, when we talked about the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the issues related to the Temple of the Mount Temple, the Mount of the Temple in Jerusalem, that may affect the whole Islamic community, and the tensions around the Mount of Temple have not decreased. On the contrary,
you mean the location that they want to build the third temple?
The third Temple of Solomon, correct. And these Israelis, extremist Israelis, have already said that they are ready to destroy the mosque that is there. So Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that's the reason why, by the way, the Palestinians named their operation Al-Aqsa Flood. So there's a relation here. But that shows also that Israel is now playing with fire in the Middle East. And that although today, because of the pressure exerted by the US, you have these tensions between Iran and its neighbors. But if you remove the US from the equation, you would have a much stable situation. And this situation, again, instead of prompting Israel to work much more on a diplomatic level try to re-establish ties with all these countries, try to have a normal relationship with all its neighbors. In fact, Israel relies on the US to do the job for them. And you may remember that one of the conditions that Trump said, so Trump mentioned to the GCC countries to receive more help from the US was they should sign the Abraham Accord, meaning that it's kind of a blackmail situation. The problem is that you can sign a document, but if you are forced to sign a document, that means you are doing that with your hand, but not with your brain, or not with your heart, and that means that there is no value in the document. And this whole aspect of the conflict that we have in the Middle East should start to be understood by the Israelis and the Americans. The Americans should start advise the Israelis that their survival is not related to destruction of all its neighbors, but it's related to the ability of Israel to integrate itself within the Middle Eastern community. And of course, that will require in turn that Israel renounce to its policy of fait accompli in the Middle East by occupying countries, by destroying this, and not being receiving any blame for that. So that's, this is Israel should understand that the way it works is not sustainable, will not be sustainable. And I think that's the indication that I don't want to expand much more because it's probably not the topic, but that's one of the lessons I take from these funerals when I saw this Saudi delegation coming to Iran, which shows both the ability of the Saudis and the Iranians, by the way, to go beyond drones, missiles, aircraft, and things like this, to go a level above that, to have a sign of peace, because it is so, to go beyond the politics, to go to something deeper. And that is, I think, the message we should, we can see the people in the street and all that we can keep in our mind for these funerals. But for myself, what I will keep in my mind for these funerals is exactly this moment, where you see that all the tensions, the regional tensions, can be left aside by people who want to talk to each other.